Hello Inspi family, thank you for joining me on this video, and thank you so much for all the support that you guys have given us since we started the Inspiwords podcast. And I really appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the engaging conversations that I've had with you guys throughout the time of the podcast. Well, I'm doing this video because I want to reflect on the lessons that I've learned from the Father's Love series. In the beginning of the series, I shared my own experience of growing up without a father and some of the questions that has brought into my life, especially during the time of my preparation for getting married. So I had quite a number of guests. I had 4 people initially, and then in the beginning of July, I had 1 bonus episode. I'll just take out a few things. Let me see how many these things are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'll say 9 key lessons that I've learned from the Father's Love series on the Inspiwords podcast. The first one comes from Uzama Sekakane, who was my first guest, but it's something that actually cuts across all the conversations I had with the different guests. Zama spoke about presence as one of the key elements of the Father's love, and one of the things that really symbolized the Father's love for her was her father's presence. And one example that I just want to draw out of that conversation is how her father, though he was blind, he would attend Zama's school plays. Even though he could not see her performing the play, but he could hear her voice. And he would make sure that he makes his way to wherever the play is and is there to support his daughter. And for me, that was very important. I think it's one of the important markers of the role that a father plays in one's life. And it cuts across all the conversations that I had. Tandogaza spoke about presence. Vanessa spoke about presence. Even Pastor Sehwapa spoke about presence. And interestingly for him, it was more about how he, being a young man, ran away from the presence of his father and focused more on playing soccer and was just a distant child. And when he looks back right now, he regrets some of the special moments that he could have shared with his father, because now his father has passed away. So I think that's an important lesson for us, to cherish our parents, especially us who still have both our parents, and to spend that time with them, even though there is what we call the generational gap. But let us be intentional about spending that time. So the first important lesson for me about the Father's love is that it is also signified by presence. Second important lesson for me comes from a conversation I had with Tandogazi. And I think one of the reels that Tandogazi that came out of Tandogazi's conversation with me really broke the internet. It went to almost 800,000 views now, which I think for me, as somebody who just started this in the beginning of the year, it's quite amazing, and I really appreciate that. So one thing that Tandogazi spoke about, she spoke about a lot of things, about the brilliant relationship that she had with her father, but one of the things that stood out for me is how her father instilled values in her, Christian values, because her father was not only just a principal in the school that Tandogazi attended, but her father was also a pastor. Part of instilling those Christian values was the talk that Tandogazi's father had with her, which is an important thing, how parents begin to have conversations with their children around issues of sex, issues of intimate relationships. so that they learn those lessons from their parents rather than learning on the street, because the streets might teach them things that the parents would not want them to learn at that stage. So, and people had Tandogazi saying that was the moment where she fell in love with her father. And I did a reel on that. I didn't even think the way that people thought about it. They're actually thinking about it in a very different way. So, and I think that drew a lot of attention, of people's attention, and eventually a lot of them would go to the YouTube channel and actually watch the full video and get the full story of what Tandogazi was talking about. But that was also a very important thing. The other thing that Utandogazi spoke about is how her father was a spiritual covering for her. A spiritual covering. I can't even imagine how important that is. Even JB spoke about it, as even in relation to his own ministry as a young man growing up. So that role of spiritual covering, how her grandfather prayed for his sons, and that kind of legacy is continuing to the sons' children, in terms of how they have stayed in the faith and they continue in the faith. That was quite important for me, as part of the signifiers of the Father's love. It tells me that the impact of the Father's love goes from generation to generation. If the fathers today do well in their fathering and in their expression of love for their children, they're not only benefiting their immediate children, but they're also benefiting their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, and generations to come. I think that's very important. And then I had Vanessa Matube, who is the author of a book titled Orphaned with Living Parents. And for me, that was quite an interesting story. In fact, it read like a movie. It was like it's a novel because of how deep the story is and how emotional the story is. She was raised by her grandmother, but she had both her parents, but she grew up like somebody who is an orphan. There is something very, very powerful that she said in that conversation. I'm not going to speak about the whole story. If you want the whole story, you must just get her book. But she said something about the impact that the absence of both her parents had a very negative impact on her and her growing up and her identity and her interactions with, even when it came to relationships with boys. But she spoke about how when she had her daughter, she had thought that her wound had healed just because the wound had stopped bleeding, which was for me very powerful. I cannot even imagine how many people are walking around with wounds that have not healed, but the wounds have just stopped bleeding. And they think they have healed, but they get triggered by several things, by different things. In her case, she got triggered by the questions that her daughter was asking about her grandparents. And I don't know, in your case, what the triggers are. I don't know what kind of wound you think has healed just because it has stopped bleeding. But that was quite a very powerful analogy, that she had to now deal and face the actual kind of pain that was caused by the absence of her parents, even though for a long time she thought that pain had healed just because the wound in her heart, in her emotions, was just not bleeding. And that also speaks to the idea of presence that I spoke about earlier, which was a theme that cuts across all the conversations that I had with my guests. I'm going to talk about two other things that came out of my conversation with Pastor Sekhwapa. The first one is a very important one, that God is the standard of fatherhood. God, as our Father in heaven, sets the standard of what it means to be a father on earth. And I think that's very important, not only for fathers, but also for people like myself who grew up without our father, to just be made to realize that, in fact, as much as my physical father, my earthly father, was not present for the most part of my life, but God was there. And JB actually emphasized this in my conversation with him, that God can actually father you. He is the father to the fatherless. And there's a lot that I can learn about what it means to be a father from looking at how God has fathered me and how God continues to father me, even though I may not have had an earthly model of a biological father fathering me for like a long time in my life. But I had God for a long time in my life. But the other important point that Pastor Sekhwapa made was that fathering is easier with God. Being a father is a very big task, but it is made easier when somebody has God on their side, when the father has God on their side. Then I had a bonus episode with JB Nevari, where we spoke about a whole lot of things. But one thing that stood out for me in that conversation is the point that he made in the beginning of the episode, actually, that for those people who grew up without their fathers, that was not how things ought to be. That is not how God designed human life to be. It may have happened that your father was absent in your life, he ran away, or whatever reason it might be that made him absent. It's not how it was designed to be. And that is why he also then made the point that when people have a void in their hearts, a void in their lives because of the absence of their fathers, that cry for a father is actually a legitimate cry. It's not because you are soft, it's not because we are tefa or anything like that. It's a legitimate cry because the father's love has a very important role to play in a person's life. As much as there are people that will say, no, I didn't have a father, but I came out fine. Yes, you came out fine, but that is not how it was supposed to be. There is something that was missing and something else had to chip in so that you come out the way that you are. But that is not how life was supposed to be. We all, by God's design, should be growing up in a nuclear family where there is a mother, there is a father, and they're all playing their role as they ought to be. So that void is legitimate. If you are feeling that, do not dismiss those feelings. It is a legitimate feeling that is reminding you that there's something that was missing, that was not there. And it needs to be dealt with love, with care, and a lot of sensitivity. And then he also spoke about how the father's love is also characterized by affirmation. And I think even the other guests also mentioned this, especially Tandogazi and Uzama spoke a lot about the weight that the father's affirmation carries. And I think a lot of people are going around with that void, with that lack of the weight that comes with the father's affirmation, and seeking affirmation in other places because that part was not properly serviced by the right people who were supposed to be providing that kind of affirmation. Those are the things I learned, and I think they really stood out for me. And I would really appreciate it that you can go back and watch those videos and look at what are the lessons that you are learning from them. And I would really love if you could share those with me on the socials, because I think one of the things that the Father's Love series did was to start conversations. I had a conversation with my dad. I remember around June, I went to see him and we had a conversation about these kinds of issues, the impact of the absence. And I think that did something, it elevated our relationship to a different level. I do believe that it was a positive impact, as much as we still have a long way to go. And I'm not expecting that it would be like a once-off event. It's a process, it's a journey, and I'm hoping that, given that these conversations are available online for you, they will continue to spark conversations between people who had estranged fathers. It would spark reconciliation. That is my hope. And for us, just as a people, to take into consideration these kinds of experiences and the impact. UJB spoke about something that is also very important, about how even our generation are messing up, in a sense that they are giving birth to children, but they're not fathering those kids. And he spoke about how that results in a cycle of fatherlessness that continues and continues for generations to generation, and how, because of such things, this kind of conversation will still be relevant 10 years from now. But I'm hoping that it would also bring awareness to many of the gentlemen, awareness of the impact of the decisions that we make. So look out for new episodes that are coming into the Inspiwords podcast next week. I have a very important and a very inspiring conversation that's coming out on the Inspiwords podcast. Do look out for others. There's going to be a lot that we'll be pushing out. I'm cooking quite a lot of inspiring content. There's gonna be another series that's coming out. I will announce in due time. But until then, continue giving your dreams a chance.